All right, hello everyone. We are going to talk about warm-ups. So I did a presentation just on warm-ups in general, kind of what they are, how we implement them as strength and conditioning coaches, different protocols that we go into, and kind of how we apply those protocols to different scenarios. So we'll kind of go more into depth on each of those, but we'll get into a little overview here. So I kind of split it up into what, why, how, and when. So under the what portion, we'll kind of get into definitions of warm-ups and then different protocols or methods that coaches will use when creating a warm-up. Next, we'll move on to the why. So why do we use warm-ups, the benefits we can get from warm-ups, and then adaptations that we can also see in our athletes from warm-ups. So there should always be a purpose with everything we do, but there should also be a purpose with warm-ups as well. It's not just a time where we check a box and say that they're warm. There are specific things that we can implement in a warm-up that will that we can see benefits of and from. Next, we'll move on to the how. So the main warm-up framework that we'll be looking at is the RAMP protocol. And that stands for raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate, and we'll get into depth on each of those there. And then more specifically, different goals that we want to see from RAMP, and then applications. How do we apply each of those four parts of RAMP in different scenarios? And then lastly, when do we use RAMP? So implementation of RAMP in different scenarios, and then within that, kind of general considerations to keep in mind, and then also more specific considerations to keep in mind. All right, going into the what, so two different definitions that I found here. So a warm-up is designed to prepare an athlete for training or competition and can improve subsequent performance and lessen the risk of injury. Different one that I found, so a period of exercise or practice to prepare for something. And then two common protocols that I found. So RAMP is the one that we'll be focusing on in this presentation. So again, it stands for raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate, and we'll get into that here in a few minutes. And then just a spin-off that I found of RAMP is heat, mobilize, and activate. Really, the only difference that this is compared to RAMP is they kind of left off the potentiate portion, but still, this would be a good warm-up. So here are just two common protocols that coaches might use, but in this warm-up presentation, we will be focusing on the RAMP protocol. All right, moving into the why, little overview here. So I just listed some benefits of warm-ups that we can see. And we'll go more into depth on each of these as well. So improvements in strength and power, rate of force development, reaction time, faster muscle contraction or relaxation time, increased blood flow to active muscles, improved oxygen delivery, decreased risk of injury, and then routine and psychological. So these are all benefits that we can see from warm-ups. It's why we use them. Again, it's not just something that we do to check a box. There are actual tangible things that can be improved in a warm-up. All right, going more into depth on each of these. So starting off with improvements in strength and power. So potentiating the nervous system for the upcoming session. And again, we'll get more into potentiation, post-activation potentiation, kind of how we use it. But that last portion of RAMP, the potentiating part, where we try and enhance muscle contractions, get the nervous system firing. The idea is that we'll see improvements in power, and then also down here, rate of force development as well. So same idea there. So hopefully we can mimic movements that are coming up, kind of in an unloaded way. So say we have like trap bar deadlifts in our lift. If we wanted to do a max med ball overhead throw. That's a way to potentiate the nervous system for the upcoming session. Also, something like sprinting, anything that is like max effort beforehand is going to potentiate the nervous system. And then second little point here, so reinforcing proper mechanics in the athletes. So this is a really good time to reinforce movement patterns that the athlete might struggle with, whether that's like squatting, hinging, bracing the core. The warm-up is a really good time where you can add in those movement patterns and try and make them stick in the athlete. And again, the idea is that if we can really reinforce proper mechanics, we will see improvements in strength and power here because they'll be able to perform the movements more efficiently, and we'll see a lot of good benefits from that. So we kind of went over the rate of force development piece, but same idea as like potentiating the nervous system. Same idea here. It's going to cause temporary enhancement of muscle contractions, resulting in improved RFD. And then last portion here, improved oxygen delivery or blood flow to active muscles. So we want to raise the heart rate and the respiratory rates during the warm-up, which is going to allow our body to adapt to the increased oxygen demand, and our body will begin delivering oxygen and blood to our muscles quicker. So raising the blood flow and oxygen rates is really important going into a lift, a match, a practice, really getting everything warm and moving before just going straight into a lift or a practice or a match. All right, next we'll move into the how. So this is where we'll really get into the ramp protocol. So like I said before, RAMP stands for raise, activate, mobilize, and potentiate. I mean, we've kind of briefly mentioned each of these, but we're going to go more into depth on each different category here. So raise, we want to elevate the athlete's heart rate, body temperature, blood flow, and then the joint fluid viscosity. So we'll get more into this. Activate, so we want to activate muscles and muscle groups that are going to be used during the upcoming session. Mobilize key joints, take the athlete through ranges of motion that they will be using in their session, and then potentiate. So we want to improve subsequent training that will take place, and then we'll get kind of into detail on like post-activation potentiation, where we use movements to reflect the training that is about to take place. In this part of the warm-up, you'll see kind of an increase in intensity, and it's important to do this piece last in the warm-up since it is going to be an increase in intensity. So the raise and mobilize are going to be lower intensity, and then this activate going into especially the potentiate portion, the intensity starts to slowly get higher going into the session. All right, going into each of these here, starting off with raise. So the way I'm going to structure each of these is I'm going to start by kind of the goals of each of these, and then we'll get into how we can actually apply it, so the application portion. So again, the goal of raise the body temperature. So this can really change the way our extracellular matrix behaves. It allows less friction between connective tissues and muscles, and it will in turn reduce the risk of injury, like we talked about in the benefit slide. Raising the heart rate or respiratory rates, so allowing our body to adapt to the increased oxygen demand that it's going to need in the match or lift or conditioning, field session, whatever it may be. And that blood flow and oxygen is going to begin being delivered to the muscles quicker. Again, blood flow, and then like we talked about, the joint fluid viscosity, so talking about like the internal friction within your joints. We can use this portion to reduce friction within the joints and allow more range of motion. So this can be during the raise portion and especially during that mobilize portion where we really want to mobilize the major joints, get them moving in ranges of motion that they're going to need for the upcoming session. All right, moving on to the application portion of this. So we'll start off kind of by lower intensity, and then you can get a little bit more specific and do more of like a high intensity raise portion of your warm-up, depending on the scenario. So just 2 examples here. For pre-lift, more general modalities like jogging, skipping, jump rope, biking, all great tools to raise the heart rate and the body temperature. And like I said, this is a little bit more of a low intensity warm-up to use. And then talking about pre-practice or a game, you can use more specific modalities, so like low intensity circuits or plyometrics with extensive med ball throws, plyometrics, something where the athlete is getting a lot of reps, but it is a little bit more high intensity. And then also just talking about like more sport or position specific warm-up, they'll typically do this with their sport coach. It's not something that we really need to worry about, but more of a specific high intensity warm-up will usually take place before practice or a game, where they're doing more like position sport specific movements, whether that's like dribbling a soccer ball or in volleyball, like passing with a partner. So just sport specific warm-up. Again, nothing we really need to worry about, but that's just a specific way that the athlete can raise their body temperature and get ready for the upcoming session. Moving on to activate. So again, the goal here, activate key muscles or muscle groups that are going to be used. And you want to ask yourself, what are the movement patterns we will be using? So this is a good spot for prehab exercises. So something like mini bands for the hips, the ankles, something that's going to really activate muscles that you'll be using in the upcoming session. And then how do we apply this? So kind of just examples for a few different body parts here. So hamstrings, glutes, core, shoulders. A way to activate the hamstrings would be to do like a long lever glute bridge. If you wanted to activate your glutes, say you have squats, or even for like a speed session, doing mini band lateral movements, lateral walks, monster walks. If you want to activate your core, a bracing series like we talked about before is a really good way to activate your core going into a session. Also a really good time to teach an athlete how to brace, which is going to protect their spine and reduce the risk of injury. And then another example there, just shoulders, doing like a banded I, Y, and T on the rack is going to activate those shoulder muscles. Moving on to mobilize. So the goal here is mobilization of the major joints, and that's going to reduce friction and allow greater range of motion. So the knees, hips, ankles, spinal column, shoulders, all really important in one, mobilization, but also stability, and we'll get a little bit more into detail on that in the next slide. But yeah, so we'll talk about this again in the next slide, but joints alternate between stable and mobile, making it important to teach both stability and mobility. And then kind of how we apply this, so stationary and dynamic examples here. More stationary mobility would be like hip, shoulder, or ankle cars, where the athlete is just stationary and they're going through that end range of motion of that joint, whether that's the hip, the shoulder, or the ankle, really taking the athlete through a full range of motion, hopefully will increase mobility in that specific joint. And then dynamic example, something like world's greatest, adductor rocks, and then T-spine reach. So they're getting mobility within these more dynamic movements, but they are a little bit more dynamic. They're warming up the body a little bit more than just being stationary. So again, just hitting on this piece a little bit more. So we talked about how the joints alternate between mobile and stable. So an example of this, so your ankle, starting from the bottom and working up, ankle needs to be mobile, your knee needs to provide stability. Hips, mobile, your lumbar spine, we need to be stable. T-spine, we want mobile, and then even like working up the arm, you want your wrist mobile, whereas you want your elbow stable. Shoulder, mobile, and then like even the top of your spine, you want stable. So kind of application piece of just this portion. So adding in T-spine mobility as a movement prep, so T-spine reach-throughs and world's greatest, and then, but also thinking about the spine, adding in a bracing series to protect the lumbar spine and teach stability. An example of this would be more of the bird dog hold or a dead bug hold, teaching the athlete to really brace their spine down, tuck their pelvis, and use their core. It's going to really reinforce good mechanics and protect their low back. All right, going into the last portion here. So the goal of potentiate is to prime the nervous system like we talked about, and this occurs due to an excitation of the neuromuscular system. More goals here, so improved muscle force production, RFD, movement efficiency, and injury prevention. So again, allowing us to ensure that all of our muscles are firing in sequence before attempting higher or heavier movements, higher volume or heavier movements. All right, going into the when portion, so when to utilize warm-ups. 4 different scenarios we'll talk about here. So pre-lift, pre-conditioning speed sessions, more of like the field session, and then pre-practice and pre-match. Again, we'll use the ramp framework, and then within that we'll talk about general considerations and also specific considerations to keep in mind. All right, starting out with pre-lift, so general considerations. So you'll see a theme with each of these, but for most all scenarios, you can really keep your raise and your mobilize portion very similar across the board. And then where you can get a little bit more specific and creative is with the activation and the potentiation portion. So these really depend on what sport, what you have coming up, saying like a practice scenario, what they have coming up in practice. This is where you can really get creative and have to keep some different aspects in mind when creating a warm-up. So just going into the general portion here, so the raise and mobilize, jogging, skipping, biking, something to raise the heart rate and temperature of the body, going into a lift, mobilize the major joints that will be necessary for the lift. So again, example, just hips, shoulders, ankles, those major joints. And then just general considerations to keep in mind. What equipment will you need and how much time will you have? So just knowing what equipment you'll need for the warm-up and having it out and ready. And then also how much time do you have? And something to keep in mind, especially in this setting, is your warm-up is also time that you have for the entire session. So if your warm-up takes 25 minutes and you only have 45 minutes with them, you're only going to get a small lift in. So just keeping that in mind, getting a really good warm-up in and making sure they're ready to go, but also being really efficient with your time. And then specific considerations, so activation and potentiation. So you can ask yourself, is the focus of the session more strength? Is it power? What muscle groups need activated or turned on for the upcoming session? So say you have a trap bar deadlift, you can use mini bands to activate the glutes and hamstrings. And then how can we potentiate the nervous system to get the most out of our lifts? Example, like we said before, if you have trap bar deadlift, you can do a med ball overhead throw. You can pair like a med ball chest pass with bench press. You can do max effort box jumps if you have hang clean, something that's going to mimic the upcoming task. So here is more of like your field session, whether it be conditioning or speed. So again, the general considerations: raise and mobilize, jog, skip, bike, whatever it may be, raise the temperature of the body, and then mobilize the major joints. Keep in mind what equipment you'll need. A lot of times you won't be at your facility. You might have to go to their field or their court for this, so making sure you have the equipment that you need. And then, again, keeping in mind how much time you'll have. And then more specific, again, getting into the activation and potentiation portion. So I used 2 different examples for each of these. So we'll talk about a speed session, and then we'll talk within that, is it acceleration focused or is it like top end speed, more velocity? So for this activation portion, if it is more of an acceleration session, making sure your glutes are activated, hip flexors are warm and ready, T-spine and ankle mobility. And then this top end speed or velocity session, you want to think more hamstring, hip flexor again, ankle stability instead of mobility, and then hip mobility as well. And so a little note here with the ankle mobility versus stability. So if you think for this velocity session, if you think about the ankle and the stretch shortening cycle, you want the ankle to be a little bit more stiff and stable in this top end speed session, because you want the athlete to really use the stretch shortening cycle effectively and be really quick off the ground for this top end speed. Whereas the acceleration, you can be a little bit more mobile because the athlete is going to be a little bit more horizontal. And then potentiate, again, if it's velocity day, you want to think more vertical because the athlete is going to be more upright when they're running. So anything more vertical focus. So skips for height, A march / A skip, and then high knees. And then also another example, if it's acceleration day, they'll be a little bit more horizontal. So potentiating them for horizontal movement, skips for distance, bounds, broad jumps, anything that is explosive in that horizontal plane. All right, pre-practice / match. So again, general considerations. You want to think again about the routine and psychological component. So kind of keeping things similar, raising the heart rate and temperature of the body, mobilize the major joints. Again, think about how much time you'll have, how much time are they warming up prior to when they're playing, and then what equipment will be available at the facility. Eventually, if you're traveling with the team, what equipment will you need to take with you for the warm-up? Will the facility have stuff that you can use? And then more specific considerations here. Obviously, you want to know what sport you're working with. Are they more of a vertical or horizontal sport? Are they more double or single leg? Do they throw or swing? So a little note here, if they are a throwing or a swinging sport, you want to emphasize scapular retraction and stability for shoulder health and injury prevention. So this would be like your baseballs, softball, volleyball, and then going into the activation and potentiation portion. Activating the hamstrings, glutes, quads, shoulders, especially pre-practice or a match. You want to make sure that everything is firing and they are good and warm and ready to go. And then the potentiation portion, again, think if they're more single or double leg, vertical or horizontal. You might want to use plyometrics that kind of mimic those movements that they'll need for the match. And then if they're more of like a top-end speed sport, are they hitting speeds that are going to emulate the upcoming task? So they don't go into a game and immediately hit a 20-mile-an-hour sprint that they weren't prepared for. That's where you're going to see some injuries. We want to do our best to prevent that. All right, here is just a little warm-up sample that I created for just volleyball as an example. So I would start with the raise portion, be specific on how far you want them to work. So I had like sideline to sideline. I would go through all of these, go into the mobility piece down here. Again, I'm specific with how far I want them working. Would go through these, and then I would move into the activation and the potentiation portion. You wouldn't necessarily have to use all of these, especially if you're a little bit more under a time constraint. So that's where you can kind of pick and choose what you think is important. But here is more of an extensive warm-up that would be good for like a pre-practice for volleyball. All right, that is all I had for my presentation. So with anything else that we do in the weight room, warm-ups can and should be fun, but there should still be a presence of focus and intent to get the most out of what we're trying to accomplish and also to prepare them for the upcoming session. So have some fun with it. It can be a time where you get the athlete mentally prepared, but also excited for what's to come, whether that's the lift, speed session, conditioning session, a time to really connect with your athletes. But yeah, there still should be a presence of focus and intent in everything that we do to really get the most out of it and see those benefits that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So I'm not sure if the assignment is going to change, but create a weight room and a field warm-up for your chosen sport, and then you will take a staff member or multiple staff members through one of those by the end of the week or whenever the assignment date is. So just create 2, and then you'll get some practical time taking one of us through your warm-up. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Again, Marcy, Vic, Chase, all really good resources to ask and watch their warm-ups, ask questions, ask what they're trying to get out of it. They've been doing it for a long time, and very different sports. So you can look at your tennis compared to volleyball or track or soccer. or even your golfs. So, appreciate you guys. Thank you for your time, and let me know if you have any questions.